Pumpkin carving patterns. How to create pumpkin patterns of people. Today I want to create a pumpkin pattern of popular political figure Ron Paul. This is a good example of what it takes to create a pumpkin pattern of a person. Last time I did a video of creating a pumpkin pattern, it was of something pretty simple, and when you get into people, there's a little bit more involved. It's a little bit more complex, especially the challenge is capturing the likeness of a person and getting that likeness into just straight black and whites that can be carved straight through a pumpkin. In addition, the challenge also is in keeping the pieces all together. Oftentimes when you're creating people, you'll have a feature that'll hang out in space, and like an eye or sometimes the mouth, that isn't attached to anything. You'll see more of what I'm talking about as we go along. I'm using Photoshop. It's an older version of Photoshop. But you can find the tools that I'm using in a free program called GIMP, which is open source, and I would recommend that. That's an excellent program. Or I believe it's Pixlr.com. Is photo editing online, and so there's other options out there, cheaper ones, or whatever photo program that you have may have similar things as this. So keep in mind that what you're using may not be exactly what you see me using. With that, let's come into images. Now, I work a lot with layers, so I'm going to come in and duplicate this layer. And I don't even care what I call it. In fact, I'm going to duplicate a couple of layers just to have them up here. With one of these layers, I'm going to do a posterize. And you'll notice that as if I do two, a lot of times, just separating it into just a couple of colors, you've almost got a pumpkin pattern already. Just chop out the whites, and this yellow right here could be a gray area. When I say whites and grays, as I'm looking at a pattern that I'm creating, interpret that in a pumpkin as white is the area you cut all the way through, showing the most light, and the gray area would be that is only cut part of the way through the pumpkin, which leaves some of the flesh of the pumpkin there, only light shows through it, but it also gives some what I would call structure to the pumpkin, so that, for example, if this black area of his eye was pumpkin that had not been cut through at all, then it would be hanging out in the middle of space. Whereas if I've got this gray area, so to speak, or the flesh of a pumpkin behind it that was only carved part of the way through, it would give this eye something to hang on to, so that it would not just be hanging out there. So that's the blacks and the whites and the grays. That's what I will be talking about as I'm doing this pattern. And so if I have a threshold, it's not a threshold, excuse me, a posterized level of 2, then I've almost got a pumpkin pattern right there as it is. I like to do a 3 or 4 or 5. Sometimes I'll play around with different levels, because you'll notice between the 3 and the 4, for example, I've got different shades of shapes. So I'm looking for shapes. When I'm creating this pattern, I'm going to be cutting out shapes, and so I see different. Basically, these levels for me are defining shape boundaries, and so I see different lines that I could follow to create different shapes if I get a 3 or a 4 threshold. These really don't mean a whole lot as far as the boundaries, because I just ignore them anyway. But they do give me a starting point, a place to look and say, okay, I'm going to try and use that for a shape. So in this case, I'm going to do a 2 and click OK. And I like to actually take the levels and lighten that way up, because you'll see in a moment when I'm working with the pen tool that if it's dark, I have a harder time trying to see more what I'm doing if it's really dark, if the pattern has high contrast. And I'm going to come to this next layer that I duplicated, and I'm going to also apply a posterized level of a 3. This is going to give me a couple of different, as you see, I've got different shapes to look at and work with between the 3 and the 4, and sometimes as I'm creating this pattern I'll oscillate between those two. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started defining the shape. Now, to define the shape, I use this pen tool. The pen tool creates a path which makes the pumpkin pattern a vector pattern. And I just like working with vectors. It gives me a clean, straight, smooth, sharp image as opposed to something that looks a little bit... the clean, crisp vector just tends to look more professional, and it gives me more flexibility when it comes to the final output and how what I choose to do with it. If I want to put it into a final finished publication that's going to be printed in a book, well, then vector is perfect. But if I'm doing it just all around, it gives me a more professional look and feel. I'm going to open up a path and start a new path, and I work with paths. This is a vector path. So that's what this pen tool is going to do now. With that, I'm going to just start tracing around. Now, as I do this, I am trying to not be so exact on what I'm seeing. I could, but that's just more work when I'm carving that I may not need to do. I'm going to just put some little poke points or shapes to make it have the look and a feel of eyebrow there, for example. For the most part, we are just capturing here the shape of a forehead. In Rumpel, sometimes I'll just go look at the straight image itself, trying to see where I want to put these points. Most of the time you see some kind of a widow's peak, and I like to try and capture that there. And in this case, no, we'll just go with this. My objective is to try and simplify this pattern as much as possible. You'll notice I'm not I'm not following strictly along any given one of these lines, and a lot of this just comes with experience in being able to just see the shape, knowing basically what features define the look of a person. Pay attention to the shape of the major features of a face. Of course, the outline of the nose, and particularly the edges and corners of the mouth and lips. Now I'm probably getting a little bit more level of detail than than I need to for a simple pattern. All these little clicks, when you're using the pen tool and the path tool, ideally you would like to do as few clicks as possible, just to keep the shapes simple. again, I'm kind of paying attention to the lips. Sometimes I will actually just follow, well, I can follow what's seen, or I can take a little bit of artistic license and just follow the shape of the lips themselves. I'm not going into any explanation of how to use this tool. You'll want to follow the online tutorials for using the pen or path tool. But if you're going to be doing a lot of artwork using Photoshop or Illustrator or other online art programs, this tool and how it works is going to be a valuable thing to learn how to use. And I'm not following exactly, I'm just trying to get the idea that, hey, there's an ear over here. Ears are not critical features that define how somebody looks, so I don't really, well, except in that the outline, you know, how big the ear is, how it defines the outside shape of the head, that's, you know, defining. But as far as, you know, paying real clear attention to just, not like an eye would be, the shape of this eye. Is more defining of capturing the likeness than an ear or some other feature might be. Anyway, so just those are some of the things to pay attention to when you're doing this. Occasionally I will even step back if I'm struggling with a particular pattern, and it's just, you know, sometimes I have a hard time capturing a likeness of somebody. I'll step back and create a caricature, just hand draw one on paper, and step back and look at that. And what that tells me, if I can get my caricature to capture a likeness on paper, then a caricature, what that does is what you're doing when you're doing a caricature is you look at the average face, or you have an idea in your mind of what an average human face might look like. The average human nose is about this shape, etc. The average human eyes fall at this place on the average human face. You know, get kind of an idea of what an average is, and then take, and as you look at a particular person, you say, what deviates from that average? Does this person have a larger than average nose, or is his mouth a little bit longer? Ron Paul's got one corner of his mouth that kind of tends to be raised higher than the other. This little distinctive shape here of his mouth is kind of Ron Paulish. Those kind of things. That's what you look at. If I get a caricature looking like a person, then I can look at what I accentuated to make that work out, and I can use that to, when I go back into creating the pumpkin pattern, to say, okay, it's the nose that's really that I want to focus attention on. And not that I'm going to exaggerate that, I might, but Not that I want to exaggerate that in the pumpkin pattern, but I want to at least realize what it is that's distinctive about this person to help frame the features that I want to pay particular attention to as I'm creating the patterns. For the most part, if you just kind of outline what you see, you're going to be good. You're going to be okay. And in this case, for example, with Ron Paul, his features, he's pretty distinctive. You follow what you see here, and it's gonna look like him. And with political or famous people, they're usually recognized enough that people will look at it and realize and recognize who it is anyway. Good grief, if you're going to do Santa Claus, just do some chubby-looking face and put a beard on it, a white beard, and you got it. Okay, right? That's all there is to it. With Abraham Lincoln, all they had to do was do some bearded guy with a big top hat, and everybody knew, oh, that's Abraham Lincoln. The more popular a character is, the more easily recognized it is. That's why I like doing cartoons. Cartoons are really fun pumpkin patterns because there's really nothing to create in them. They're really easy. The problem you run into in a case like mine would be posting that on my site is going to violate, usually violates copyrights. If it's a popular cartoon, and that's because it's popular because some Hanna-Barbera or Disney or somebody's been promoting it, and everyone knows what that is, and it's a copyrighted image. You just can't freely use those. But if you know how to create pumpkin patterns, then you just create your own, right? You don't have to worry about going to some site that's going to violate a copyright by posting it on there, unless Disney itself is selling it. But if you create your own, wow, you're good to go. You pick any celebrity you want, pick any cartoon you want, and then you have the unique pumpkin on the block. Okay, I've basically got an outline and drawn out all the features by following along with the shapes that I saw as I was creating. And if you saw what I didn't really follow any of these lines. That's because a lot of this is I'm taking artistic license and saying, well, that's probably going to look okay if I outline it like that with me. I have enough experience doing portraits that I can almost just see things with these lines. But I always pop in here, create a new layer, if I really want to see what I got. And I can't really see that until I do this anyway, although I might have a good idea if it's going to work out. In fact, I bet you I'm going to need to add something to the outside of these cheeks to add some to outline the shape of the face. But let's see what this looks like. I come into my path and I turn that into a selection, and then I turn that selection white, I inverse that selection, turn it black, and that gives me this pumpkin pattern that I just created. And in this case, that looks pretty close to Ron Paul. I want to step back and look at it. Sometimes I can get an idea if I just zoom out. It's like stepping away from the computer. Okay? Or, getting real close and seeing, do I have what it takes. And in this case, it doesn't look like I'm really going to change that much. You have this feature, this eye, that in a pumpkin that's going to be the first thing that's going to start drooping, right? In this case, I think there's a big enough flesh of the pumpkin to hang on where it's going to be okay. But if that wasn't the case, then I would need to come back in there with some grays, some gray area to try and capture that. This is a real thin area right here that you see on the mouth that we got that pumpkin hanging on. So I might actually want to come in here and add some structure to that. I could do that with a little bit of gray, or as I'm carving it, I would tend to carve it at an angle as such that that has more flesh there. I'm going to make one more simple change. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to come into here, and just because I want to outline the shape of his face right here, whoops, need to get back into this path. I want to capture that, because this, now you'll notice that isn't really a, as far as the blacks and whites of the pattern, you don't even see it here. It's all, it would be black, but yet I want to outline that because it defines the outside shape of this of a facial feature. And so by including that, and here's another trick that I do, is I'll come in here and add a new layer. Okay, now I've got the pumpkin pattern layer that I already did here, but I'm going to create a new one now that I've made a little bit of a change. Okay, I'm going to come into this, I'm going to highlight that layer, come into this path, and I'm going to turn it black and white, just like I did the layer underneath it. And now by clicking this on and off, I can see what did I change, and does that change look better. I particularly use this when I've working on an eye or a mouth or some feature that just doesn't quite look right. And when I make a change to my path and redo that, then I can come back in here and look at the difference between the two layers and make a visual decision. Does that improve or not what I had before? And in this case, I think it adds, so I'm going to leave that right there because it improves it. It helps define a little bit of the shape of his face that's there. And now I'm going to call that done. Of course, the final step to making this a pattern, and I will actually create a new layer, and if I was ambitious I would actually label these, but on this layer I'm going to just turn the whole image white, okay, and then take this path and fill it with about 30% foreground color, and then deselect that and stroke the path. Before I stroke the path though, I need to make sure that I grab a paint. See, if I stroked it now, it would stroke it with a very thick line. We don't want that. We want something more, whoa, let's try, is this still too thin? That might be okay. You know, we go even way 1 pixel. I like to have kind of a good border on these, so we're going to do a paintbrush of 3 pixels and stroke the path. Stroke that path with that brush stroke that I just did, and look at that, turn the path off, and there is a pumpkin pattern. Okay? Transfer that to the surface of your pumpkin and carve out all those pieces, and voila, you're going to have a pumpkin of Ron Paul. For more great pumpkin patterns and cool pumpkin carving tips, go visit pumpkinglow.com.